We had been in severe, exceptional drought across the state leading up to the June flood.
There's just an awful lot of destruction, and we'll just have to adapt, which is what ranchers do every single day.
We need to teach young people a different approach to science than just collecting data on a piece of paper. We actually need them to go and stand by the river and listen to it.
The fish kill happened in 2016, so we made an effort to kind of recreate the watershed group. And it's still hard for some ranchers to sit in the room with all those environmental groups, but there's dialogue. And before, there wasn't dialogue. So it is a step in the right direction.
Welcome to the Stories for Action podcast. This episode is part of the Life in the Land project, which is a series of films and podcasts produced by Stories for Action, which hears from folks that interact with the complexities of Montana's landscapes and communities, speaking to the value of locally led and collaborative work, and the holistic approaches needed for healthy communities and the ecosystems that they're a part of. I'm your host, Laura Tomov. This is the first of two podcast episodes that accompany the Life in the Land film episode that came out last November on the Upper Yellowstone River. The film and these two podcast episodes look at how no matter what the pressure on the river, be it flood, drought, impacts from increased river recreation, or development, that greater resilience can be achieved when the response is guided by the local community and by the river itself. The film and these episodes touch on elements of connection, socially and environmentally, those connections that have been lost, and where there are areas to repair. And it shows that in order to talk about the health of a river, the health and well-being of the people connected to that river is a big part of that conversation. You can find the 52-minute film at lifeintheland.org, where it's available for free for personal viewership and really meant to be used in gatherings for communities, organizations, classrooms, anyone, to kick off deeper dialogue around these topics. So please reach out to us through the site if you wish to host a free screening at your gathering, or reach out for resources that we can provide you if you want to hold a facilitated discussion after you screen the film. Both this podcast episode and the following one will look at themes of connection, and both feature elements of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group, which is a collaborative working group of local residents, including ranchers, outdoor recreation business owners, agencies, conservation organizations, and more, who are all involved in dialogue and programs that benefit all elements of the Upper Yellowstone watershed. Today's episode will focus on the flood of the Yellowstone River in 2022 and methods to improve resiliency for the river and human communities. The next episode, Part 2, will have a focus on the response to impacts from increased river recreation here, as well as the realistic challenges and values of collaborative approaches. So be sure to subscribe to catch the next podcast episode when that one drops, likely next week. Now, with any place, some context is necessary. And keep in mind, this context of the Upper Yellowstone River region is very much abridged. The Yellowstone River is the culmination of water streaming down from various mountain ranges, prairie expanses, and it flows through communities small and large. The name for this river, by multiple native tribes including the Apsalaga, a Crow tribe, is the Elk River, as it was and still can be a major migration corridor for elk moving from the summer range in current Yellowstone National Park area to winter range on the prairies. Today, the Yellowstone River is the largest undammed river in the United States outside of Alaska, making its ecological potential really stand out. The Yellowstone River is the headwaters to a great deal of the waterways in the entire United States. It begins in Wyoming, flows through the state of Montana, then into North Dakota, where its waters continue on through the Missouri River and eventually the Mississippi River, then to the ocean at the Gulf of Mexico. With its origins in the mountains of northwest Wyoming, it flows through Yellowstone National Park and Yellowstone Lake, and north into Montana and into a valley that today is commonly referred to as Paradise Valley. This stretch of the Upper Yellowstone River, from the community of Gardner at the north entrance of Yellowstone Park, downstream to the town of Livingston, will be the focal point of this story. Paradise Valley is defined on each side by the Gallatin and Absaroka mountain ranges. The geography here was shaped by a period of dramatic continental movement 40 to 80 million years ago, followed by volcanic activity and by the growth and receding of glaciers. The river here journeys through sagebrush slopes and canyon walls before entering the valley's wider expanse, where cottonwood galleries, or groves, shade its banks. People of various indigenous tribes have interacted with and stewarded all elements of this valley's landscape at varying periods of time over at least the last 13,000 years. For them, the valley has long been hunting and ceremonial grounds, a travel corridor, and a place considered home. In the late 1700s, French fur traders and trappers made their way into this region. In 1851, the Laramie Treaty defined this valley and the Yellowstone River as the western boundary of the reduced territory and reservation of the Crow tribe. Also during this time, the promise of gold and grasslands for cattle ranching brought European Americans to also inhabit this valley, with a heightened influx after 1865 with the end of the Civil War. In the decade to follow, the Crow Reservation was further reduced, and the boundary line was pushed further east to no longer include this valley. In 1872, Yellowstone National Park was established to the south of this valley, and this area became an early site for American recreation, tourism, and commercial hunting. In 1882, the town of Livingston, just outside the north boundary of the valley, was incorporated to serve as a railroad hub for the Northern Pacific Railway line. Early on, a small train line linked Livingston to the community of Gardner, bringing folks from around the world to visit this valley and Yellowstone National Park. Throughout the 1900s, the communities of this valley continued to establish primarily around the economies of cattle ranching, mining, recreation, timber, and Livingston's status as a railroad hub. Today, though the smaller train line down Paradise Valley has been replaced by Highway 89, the natural beauty still brings people here from near and far, not only for the national park, but for this valley, the mountains, and the Yellowstone River. This river binds the communities here, which from Pine Creek to Gardner are all unincorporated. Most of the folks who live here have their lives and livelihoods intertwined with this landscape, and therefore this river, when the elements are both heavenly or harsh, with winters often bringing forceful winds and 30-plus degrees below zero. There are endless examples of folks here showing their connection and respect for this place, through hard work, local engagement, and looking out for the well-being of the landscape and their neighbors. The local economy today is still led by recreation, tourism, and agriculture, all of which depend on the health of this river. This river and Paradise Valley are part of what is considered the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is one of the largest, nearly intact temperate zone ecosystems on Earth, allowing it to hold the highest concentration of wildlife in the lower 48 states. Those who know this landscape well know that it's possible to appreciate and respect everything's value within the ecosystem while simultaneously experiencing realistic challenges of a shared landscape. In recent decades, the neighboring town of Bozeman, which sits just over the pass west of Paradise Valley, has gone from an agricultural and university town to a city with one of the country's fastest growth rates and housing costs that far outweigh its residents' average incomes. Echoes of these trends are seen in the town of Livingston. Paradise Valley itself is seeing rapid increases in recreation numbers and shifts from small family-owned ranches and working-class residents to subdivided land and a wealthier demographic who are often only seasonal residents. All this to say, there are social complexities in this valley, including a broad spectrum of values, incomes, conservation goals, and livelihoods. and some may say an underlying threat of local voices being overshadowed by outsiders' focus on the nearby national park, the status of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, or the neighboring cities. There's a fine line between wanting to be recognized as more than just a drive-through valley on your way to Yellowstone Park, but not to be too closely recognized, which fuels the trend of transferring open space to dense subdivisions or wealthy seasonal homebuyers who are pricing locals out. Climate change is evident in every season. In the last few years alone, the valley has experienced record heat, ongoing drought, a historic flooding event, and noticeable impacts on a range of species. In the face of complexities and increasing pressures, how do we meaningfully listen and learn from that which moves within this landscape? The river, the wildlife, the people who are intimately connected to this place. And how do responses to these pressures interconnect in ways that reflect the complexity of the place and respect individual perspectives while improving collective well-being? And how does this provide all of us, no matter where in the world we call home, guidance on how we connect to one another, our place, and our rivers? To further paint the picture of the setting here, we'll start by hearing some words about the Upper Yellowstone River from people who are connected to this river. All of these interviews were conducted in the fall of 2022, just months after the historic flooding of the Yellowstone River that June. First, we hear from Wendy Weaver, who's executive director of Montana Freshwater Partners, an entity that works with organizations, government agencies, and private parties to restore, enhance, and preserve waterways and aquatic ecosystems throughout Montana.
I think one of the really special things about the Yellowstone River is it's the longest undammed, free-flowing river in the lower 48. And that is becoming a rarity nowadays with a lot of the alteration, dams, other types of change on rivers. One of the other really special things about the Yellowstone is its large, expansive cottonwood galleries along the entire stretch of the river. A lot of rivers are controlled so much that they don't have that natural function to bring in these cottonwood galleries and other vegetative communities.
Wendy's professional background is actually in civil engineering, but she transitioned into the nonprofit world with Montana Freshwater Partners to be more closely aligned with her values and deep love of Montana's rivers.
Moving back to Livingston and literally living 5 minutes from the river is what really just confirmed how important they are in my well-being and feeling happy and fulfilled in my life.
And now we hear from Dale Sexton, co-owner of Dan Bailey's Outdoor Company, an outdoor recreation guide and apparel shop located in Livingston that serves as a local institution nearly 100 years old.
I mean, I was born and raised in Livingston, and I had a father and a mother who very much liked to fish, and it was ingrained to me before I could even walk, frankly. We lived on trout, largely, and wild game. It was foundational for me in my infancy and in my youth, and now in my adulthood. I still find great pleasure in spending time on the Yellowstone. And I really don't have the words to describe how special it really is.
The evening before this interview with Dale, my co-producer Cassie Heron and I met Dale and his 2 teenage daughters along the Yellowstone River to film them doing what they have been doing together for likely all of the girls' lives, to fish and simply to be together in the presence of the Yellowstone River.
I'm fortunate in that my passion is being outside, but it's never more fulfilling than when I'm able to share in the experience with my daughters. Just being on the Yellowstone last evening and the bird life that we saw and the impending storm, it just was really incredible, as it is every time.
Dale speaks to some of the history of Dan Bailey, the first owner and namesake of the shop that Dale now co-owns.
Dan Bailey's has a very rich history. Him and his wife moved here from New York and started this fishing business in 1938. And it's been an institution since the day he arrived. The only way I can describe it is it's an honor to be within these walls. He was a conservationist at heart, and anything and everything that was conservation related with regard to the Yellowstone, and also just with regard to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It wasn't just waters. Dan Bailey is most recognized for his role in stopping the Allen Spur Dam, along with numerous other individuals.
The Allen Spur Dam that Dale mentions here was proposed in the 1970s. It was part of a larger proposal to construct a series of dams and reservoirs along the length of the Yellowstone River to conduct electricity. The Allen Spur Dam was proposed as a 380-foot high dam to be built just south of Livingston. The structure would have flooded 20,000 acres of land along a 30-mile stretch of the Paradise Valley. The dam's construction was prevented due to coordinated and tireless grassroots efforts and outreach campaigns largely led by Jim Posowitz, who at the time was with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, as well as Dan Bailey and others. And here's Druska Kinky, a cattle rancher in the unincorporated community of Emigrant, midway down the valley. Being out on the land every day, for most of the day, rain, shine, or a 40-degree below zero blizzard, the land has seeped deeply into her sense of self. Here she describes that connection.
Every spring, it's not spring until you see the bluebirds, hear the robins, and hear the sandhill cranes. And so you come outside to go check the calving first thing in the morning, and it's really early, and you can just hear those eagles just chirping away at each other. And it's a great sound. It helps connect you to the land. That connection isn't broken. It's good to sustain that.
Druska's husband's family has ranched in this spot since the 40s, and she married into the ranch life. She raised her kids here, and now she has grandchildren who she's able to connect to the land when they come to visit. Though she's been here most of her adult life, she recognizes that she can still be seen as a newcomer.
There's a large emotional investment to the land. I appreciate the stability and the sense of place because I never had that growing up.
And the fourth person we hear from in this episode is Scott Frazier. Scott is a traditional ecological knowledge educator and director of organization Project Indigenous. He is Santee and an enrolled Crow or Absalaga tribal member. He's worked for over 30 years as an educator around the world, with a large focus on connecting people to their landscapes, largely water and rivers. A lot of his work has been at the headwaters of the Yellowstone River in Yellowstone National Park. He grew up in Billings, a city that the Yellowstone River runs through 120 miles downstream from Paradise Valley. He told me he remembers that when he was young, the adults actually warned the kids not to play in the river in the Billings area due to regular sightings of large unnatural debris such as entire cars being pulled from the river. Scott currently lives along a tributary of the Yellowstone River, and he's spent a great deal of time connecting to all stretches of this river, personally and professionally.
The Yellowstone River gets overshadowed by the Yellowstone Park. I think people just sort of put the river, it's sort of going on its merry way, and we don't have to think about that. But actually the thing is we're all connected. Upstream, downstream, it doesn't really matter. We are connected to the Yellowstone, to every river. When I look at Yellowstone Lake, I'm looking at the whole country. It's pulsing water to our country and feeding and keeping people nourished. And the opportunity for people in water in this river is that they need to go and acknowledge it and stand with it, honor it.
Here again is Wendy Weaver, Livingston resident and executive director of Montana Freshwater Partners.
You know, I think Yellowstone is relatively a healthy river, but I don't think it's immune to threats that it has faced over decades. The biggest wake-up call that we had in the last 10 years was in 2016 with the whitefish kill. And that happened because of PKD, which is proliferative kidney disease.
PKD is caused by a parasite, which can be brought from other waterways. Its impact can be exacerbated by increased water temperatures, which the Yellowstone River experienced in the month leading up to the fish kill. In August and September of 2016, PKD killed an estimated tens of thousands of mountain whitefish, causing Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to close 183 miles of the Yellowstone River to all recreational activities for several weeks. Closure resulted in a total estimated economic loss of $500,000 for local businesses from Gardner downstream to Laurel, Montana.
The response to that was pretty divisive. It really pitted a lot of the recreation fishing outfitting community against the producers and the landowners along the river. The fishing community, the outfitters and guides, they make most of their money during the summer. When Fish, Wildlife, and Parks shut down the river, it essentially shut down their work for a period of time, and that created a lot of animosity. When they looked alongside the river and they still saw pivots irrigating the river, it really upset them. Like, why does the ag community still allowed to irrigate as if nothing's going on, and our entire livelihood is essentially shut down?
Here's Dreska, rancher and immigrant, with her perspective on the response.
There was a lot of finger pointing that occurred. A lot of people wanted to blame irrigation in the valley for less water in the river, which raised the temperatures, which then allowed for the PKD to hit. We have had multiple discussions in the watershed group and through the editorials in the paper about how that is or is not true. And of course, my philosophy is it's not true. And I think we just have to keep in mind that there are so many things that affect the river and the tributaries that it's not as simple as one thing.
Here's Wendy again on the action that was sparked by this wake-up call.
We didn't have any information or data to even understand what was going on, and it was one of the things that made us realize we can't manage what we're not measuring. And we had no idea how many whitefish were in this river. We didn't have proper monitoring to understand what water temperature was and water quality issues. And that's what started us on that path of trying to get better monitoring in place and working with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to understand what the threats were to the Yellowstone in that way.
In response to the whitefish kill, Montana Freshwater Partners hosted a river symposium in 2017.
And we brought together landowners, we had technical experts, we had just the interested public to come together so that we could talk about what threats that the river has and what we can do better to protect it into the future for better resiliency. And so that was really what catalyzed the effort of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group today.
The Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group is a collaboration among those who live, work, and are connected to the elements of this watershed. Membership includes local ranchers, recreational business owners, government agencies, conservation organizations, interested residents, and more. The group focuses on the stretch of the Upper Yellowstone watershed within Paradise Valley, from the north boundary of Yellowstone Park and the community of Gardner, downstream to Carter's Bridge, just south of Livingston. As a watershed group, their collaborative efforts touch on a variety of elements, from mountain top to river bottom, and everything in between in the valley, looking at locally guided ways to improve both landscape and socioeconomic health. The group not only creates a collective space to exchange ideas and discuss responses, but it facilitates projects, leads community education and outreach, and coordinates the collection and dissemination of scientifically sound monitoring and assessment data. Some current watershed group projects include a recreational use study, flood and drought resiliency planning, and efforts to reduce wildlife conflict for ranchers, not only with predators, but with grazing ungulates. The Give Back to the Yellowstone campaign garners funding to support some of those projects. Partnering businesses spread the word to their customers about the campaign, creating an opportunity for recreation tourists to contribute to the health of the landscape directly and the river that they come to enjoy. The watershed group consists of subcommittees, but the group comes together in its entirety at quarterly meetings, which are open to the public. Both Wendy and Dreska are members of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. Wendy serves as an advisor, and Dreska is a former chairperson. Druska speaks here about how the whitefish kill sparked a change in the watershed group's participating demographic.
The Upper Yellowstone watershed group has been around for a long time. In the beginning, it was mostly an ag group. A bunch of ranchers would come to these meetings, and whatever speakers and information was shared was always ag-oriented. Then the fish kill happened in 2016, so we made an effort to kind of recreate the watershed group. In doing that, it became obvious that it was going to be a more diverse group than what the ranching community was used to. Bottom line, the ranching community didn't like that.
The diversity in the group's participation that Druska is referring to came to include recreation and angling businesses, conservation organizations, both local and national, state and federal agencies, and additional local landowners who weren't ranchers, but were interested in improving the health of their land. Wendy speaks here about the response to this expansion of the watershed group.
It exasperated a lot of the trust issues that had been pretty long-standing in the valley and was not received very well.
Both Druska and Wendy shared with me how this change made many of the ranchers who were original members of the watershed group express that they no longer wanted to be part of the group.
I think some of the trust issues that we saw in the early stages of reforming the Upper Yellowstone watershed group still exist today. And I think there are different reasons.
As Wendy mentions, there's no one reason to say why tensions or skepticism exists between ranchers, anglers, and conservation groups. And of course, that's a generalization with endless exceptions and examples of positive, trusting relationships and partnerships between those folks. But most people in the West can say this is a known concept. In the Paradise Valley, these tensions can stem between ranchers and anglers for the reasons mentioned in the wake of the whitefish kill. Impacts to river or landscape health can spark regulations or public blame, which nobody wants. So different sides can cast blame on the other for being the root cause of the impact. In this valley, there's also a history of conflict over water in the tributaries to the Yellowstone River, and claims of how irrigation can impact fish spawning habitat. Wendy mentions how the trust issues can go both ways, not just stemming from the position of the ranchers.
The trust issues also extend to the other side as well. You know, there's assumptions being made on whether it's fertilizer application or land management practices or irrigation practices that they assume are degrading the river in such a way that aren't actually true. So I think we see that from both sides.
In recent years, the watershed group consulted with a state hydrologist whose studies found that most of the water that's diverted in the springtime from the Yellowstone River and its tributaries to be used for irrigation ditches and canals actually seeps through the soil and recharges the groundwater, where some of it actually makes its way back to the Yellowstone River through underground drainage in the soil. This recharge water brings much-needed cooling to the river in late summer months, which benefits fish populations and river health. Of course, this and every other element of the watershed is very complex, but this is just to show just one example of how discussion and data collection can clarify assumptions. And speaking to the tensions or issues of trust that exist in this valley, it's not unique to Paradise Valley. And this context also comes with the reality that there are endless examples of folks from all sectors working together on some great partnerships or have great friendships, and individual human relationships that contradict the generalized branding of one entity's stance on a topic, or feuds between groups. I just have to include some of this context on the social dynamics here to show just what a big deal it is to get these folks together in a room on a regular basis. I think that alone is really something to commend and celebrate. And maybe speaking more openly about the roots of past and current tensions can build relationships better than trying to act like they don't exist. For the watershed group, when it expanded to include a more diverse participation, and some rancher membership said they no longer wanted to be part of the group, Druska shares here about how they were able to get those folks back into the room.
One of the ways that we created it for ag Ag Lands Working Lands was to actually create a committee of the watershed called Paradise Valley Working Lands Group. And then we got the ranchers back into the room, and that committee reports those efforts and all that information back to the Upper Yellowstone group. So it's been an effort to remain diversified, but at the same time make sure that there was a place for everyone to have a say. It's created a more diverse group, and we've gotten a lot more nonprofits involved that really bring a richness to the watershed. They want to partner, they want to help, and it's still hard for some ranchers to sit in the room with all those environmental groups. But there's dialogue, and before there wasn't dialogue. So it is a step in the right direction.
Wendy mentions an approach of the watershed group that's helped to create alignment and focus in the group.
One of the first things that we did when we were rebuilding this watershed group was to come together and talk about what our common goals and our common values were. We've used that as a guiding compass in many ways. The more we can embrace being able to have conversation about something that might be deemed very controversial is going to be how we start to build relationships and work through some of these contentious issues in the watershed.
As we mentioned earlier, the current mission of the Watershed Group addresses issues that lie at the intersection of landscape, community, and economic well-being of the valley. And as those things intersect at every level here, all of their efforts naturally take a holistic approach. Wendy continues here.
When we're talking about protecting the river, it is looking at not only the environmental aspects of protecting the river, but the socioeconomic aspects. So we are looking at where is there degradation that can have restoration happen? Where can we work with landowners for improved soil health, which we know is really important for river health? When we have a healthy river, it diminishes, it reduces the conflict, and allows us to work together better when there's less pressures.
In 2022, after a low snowpack winter, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem experienced late spring snowfall. Then, in early June, there was a sudden hit of abnormally high temperatures, which caused rapid snowmelt from the mountains. This combined with intense rainfall and the region receiving the equivalent of 2 to 3 months worth of summer precipitation in just 3 days. On June 13th, 2022, the Yellowstone River, which was already running high, went from 28,000 CFS to over 55,000 CFS, nearly doubling its volume in a 24-hour period. Wendy begins here.
We had been in severe, exceptional drought across the state leading up to the June flood. For me personally, it will be a day in history that I will never forget. So when I woke up that morning and started to see what was happening at Carbella and upstream and at the Corwin Springs gauge, we knew it was going to be unlike anything that we've ever experienced. Once it became evident that we were going to see almost a double peak flow than the river had ever experienced in the last 100 years, it started to get scary.
Connor Parrish, a program manager for Trout Unlimited and resident of Livingston, shares some of his experience here.
We had some friends who had some of their property that was at risk for flooding, so came down and joined up in the effort to try and protect some people's homes, sandbagging, digging trenches and things of that nature. But it was just kind of overwhelming. There was so much going on, and a lot of this water wasn't even coming over the levee necessarily. A lot of it was just bubbling up through the ground, so people weren't really prepared to that. You know, how do you sandbag water that's just bubbling up from the ground instead of washing in from the river? So it was just kind of really overwhelming, and unfortunately all the people's homes that I really helped with ended up getting flooded.
Wendy speaks here about efforts coordinated by Park County Environmental Council, which is an organization that works to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and people of Park County through grassroots organizing and community advocacy. Their work involves a large gamut of projects and efforts, but on the day of the flood, their work suddenly involved coordinating community volunteers, sandbagging a large levee that barricades the Yellowstone River from the entire east side of Livingston, which includes the high school and working-class neighborhoods.
One of the beautiful things about that day is seeing Park County Environmental Council really show up and coordinate volunteers in a way that our local government really couldn't do. And so because of them immediately taking action, getting sand, getting people to come out and fill sandbags and trying to get them out to the community, I think made a huge difference in how we responded to that. You know, the police were pushing us out of the park when that started to breach. People just kind of overpowered what was going on, and I would credit them with saving the town from that levee busting out and flooding the east side of Livingston.
Wendy, who herself is a civil engineer, mentions that you can look at historic maps of the area and see that the east side of Livingston lies in the floodplain of the Yellowstone River. Dale Sexton, co-owner of Dan Bailey's Outdoor Company, who is also a lifelong resident of Livingston, also jumped in to help how he could and sandbagged at the east side of town. He shares here about his own realizations immediately following the peak flooding.
My first thought was about those whose lives were directly impacted, i.e., wow, I've got 5 feet of water in my home, to, wow, Yellowstone Park entrance at the north is closed. What does that mean financially for our business? What does that mean for the community of Livingston from an economic perspective? So it was a lot. The river somehow manages to always take care of itself. The river has been evolving for millennia with flood events, but we're still feeling it and we're still seeing it. You just take a drive down the valley and you can recognize that something happened pretty dramatically, even if you're not aware.
Now we hear from Druska, whose family ranch lies along the edge of the Yellowstone River in Emigrant, about 25 miles upstream from Livingston.
The morning of the flood, it had been raining pretty steady for a couple, 3 days, which, we thought was great because the land needs a lot of water. But got up around 5:36 that morning. My husband started worrying. We had about 30 animals down here on the river bottom. And he was up and he said, you know what, we better go check on those guys. Because you could see that the water was up pretty far, even from the kitchen window at the house. But we needed to get them out of here because the water was rising pretty fast. Then we had some animals behind the barn that were right up against the fence. And we had bulls in this pen right here. So all of those animals were getting pressed by water. The neighbor actually was here. They're from Sacramento. And he came over and he and I went down and we were helping my son and my husband. It took 4 of us to get those cattle, to convince them to go through another gate, through some more water, into a safer pasture. And by the time we got back over here, the water had risen clear up to that feeder that's in that pen.
Cassie and I were standing there with Druska, on her property at the river's edge, roughly 3 months after the flood. This whole area that we were looking out over, which was now almost entirely covered in deep sand or gravel, is the area that the Kinkeys use for their calving grounds every year, roughly from January through June. So early in the year, the heavies, or cows that are about to give birth to a calf, are brought to this area, and it would normally be a safe area for mother cows and their calves. Druska verbally paints the picture for us, as at the moment it was a very different scene. But she said the whole area would be filled with dense, deep, lush green grass for the mother cows and calves to feed on and have comfortable bedding. And the animals could find shelter here from spring storms. Druska pointed to a small island of willow trees a ways out in the river. She said that was the former edge of their bank, whereas now the land between us and that small island was eroded away and was now a low-lying gravel bar trench.
You can see how much land we've lost all through here. We've got a steep 3-foot, 4-foot drop off here that wasn't there before. Our willows are gone. It's deposited all of this silt, and when the wind blows now, it's just like the Dust Bowl. And it will be really, really hard on cows and calves as we bring them home from the mountains and, start our winter feeding, calving routine, because this is the kind of dust that poses a real health hazard for them in terms of pneumonia. So it's going to be bad, and we'll just have to adapt, which is what ranchers do every single day, is adapt to changing conditions. And our conditions have certainly changed.
Between the infrastructure repairs and the riverbank restoration, including the hefty cost of necessary permitting to complete streambank restoration, Druska estimated that the total cost for them to fix things up is easily in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Druska speaks here about what they found on their property in the aftermath of the flood, and the unknowns for them on which steps to take forward. Just a reminder, this conversation, like all the interviews in this episode, took place in the fall of 2022, 3 to 4 months after the flood.
We had somebody's refrigerator sitting on our pile, complete with food, which actually gave me a really awful feeling. We've had toys and other belongings of people that are down there, and it's really quite sad to think that those were once in somebody's house. So there's just an awful lot of destruction, and we aren't qualified to know what's best to do with this bank, so we need experts. It's been hard to get people knowledgeable to come and look. None of it's as fast as you want it to be, and that's really frustrating. We're looking at having to start our fall work, and that's going to take away from time we could be working down here. And so there's always this sense of urgency that you have about getting it done, and then all of the paperwork and the permitting and all of the regulations and knowing what you can do and can't do, and it's a little overwhelming. Actually, a lot overwhelming. So it's hard to know what to do.
I asked Druska what things were like in the immediate aftermath of the flood, if and how folks were connecting to help one another.
For the most part, everybody was overwhelmed with their own mess. We did have people later on, do you need any help? We had hunters from Washington say they were ready to come if we needed them, which was very nice. But it's so hard when there's so much help being offered and you have no clue what to do. There was nothing for them to do for a long time. Any of the agencies that were going to offer us any help said you can't do anything until we get a project approved.
Druska mentions how it's not the easiest for ranchers to accept help, even if the truth is that they need it. I ask her to elaborate on this.
I think it's hard for ranchers in general to accept help. They're used to doing everything themselves and fixing things themselves and being independent. So I think it's hard for them to say, sure, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm going to get this crew of workers that I know nothing about, and they're going to come in and they're going to help me clean up. That's never going to happen here. It might happen some places, but it won't happen here, which is a good and a bad. You get the satisfaction of doing your own cleanup and fixing your place, but you need help.
She expressed how, despite the challenges that they were up against, they knew they were fortunate compared to others who lost homes or animals.
As you went later into some of the meetings that the watershed had and you heard about other things that had happened to people, it was devastating. There were animals lost, and that was heartbreaking. In a lot of the river, there's islands, sort of. They're all connected to the land, but when the river is high, they become more like islands. And there's usually a lot of brush and grass on these places, and so when it had been raining so hard, the animals accessed those places because there was a lot of cover and protection against the rain. And then the flood happened so fast and so high, and they couldn't get back. So they were gone.
During this flooding event, the entire length of the Yellowstone River and its tributaries throughout central and eastern Montana experienced record-breaking and devastating flooding. For Paradise Valley, in addition to homes lost and infrastructure damaged, the economic drivers in the valley, agriculture and recreational tourism, took a huge hit. The flooding took out the road going into the north entrance of Yellowstone National Park, leading to a full closure of the park for months. The park's closures in Gardner resulted in a massive hit to the region's local businesses during the summer season, which is when these businesses make the bulk of their revenue for the entire year. I myself live in Montana, but 4 hours to the west of Paradise Valley, and I remember when this flood was taking place, that in the couple of weeks to follow, the floods were the top headlines in news around the state, and even nationally and internationally for a bit. And the reality is that even a couple of months after the floods, if you weren't directly in this valley or somewhere near the river, it was no longer on most people's minds. But standing here on the eroded riverbank with Dreska, it was clear that the impact was still fresh, the challenges current, and in some ways the moving forward hadn't even begun yet. I asked Dreska if she also gets this sense that if folks don't see it in the news, they may assume things are back to normal for everyone.
As time has gone on, one of the things that has become very clear to me, and I'm just as guilty of it as other people, you're captured by disasters that happen in parts of the world, parts of the United States, and it's all horrible and tragic. Then it becomes yesterday's news. Yellowstone got closed, Gardner was shut down, the tourist industry took a huge hit, the rec industry took a huge hit, and the ag land is gone. But if you don't live here, you don't care. And I don't mean that in such a negative sense on people, because everybody's got so much to deal with in their lives. But it became clear to me how much time has happened after a disaster. It's really easy not to have an understanding of what those impacts are long term.
I asked Dreska about the disconnect she mentions between those on the ground who need assistance to repair the damages and the entities that are tasked with providing resources for folks.
The agencies that come to assist with their programs, there's not a lot of them that help ag land. And the one agency that did come, they told my husband, we have money to help you replace the stackyard, but you have to put it in the same spot. And why would you do that? We'll put it somewhere else where it's not going to flood and fall into the river again. To me, that is just the best illustration of how poorly government understands. And there's so many hoops to jump through. And at the end of the day, you're so exhausted just trying to survive. Trying to navigate these programs is impossible.
Wendy speaks here about how it became clear that there were consistent challenges for folks as they navigated the relief programs. And the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group came together to see what they could do as a collective voice.
One of the things that we did is trying to coordinate all the agencies so that they were at least working together in some form or fashion.
The Watershed Group, in partnership with Montana Freshwater Partners, were able to gather more than 20 people representing different agencies and entities from around the state, from Army Corps of Engineers to DNRC to FWP to Park County officials, and many more. They organized these folks to meet at a rancher's property in the valley, to walk the property and see the flood impacts firsthand, then to partake in rigorous discussion and bounce ideas and concerns off one another.
It was amazing to see us come together and talking about how can we help the landowners navigate the chaos of funding and agency permitting regulatory requirements post-flood in a way that can actually help them and get them the resources that they need, while we also balance trying to look at alternative type of strategies we use to rebuild.
Those who have tried to organize almost 24 people representing different agencies or organizations in a short amount of time to travel and do a field visit can understand what a big feat this was. And realistically, the nature of these entities' work can lead to them operating siloed from each other. So just to create an opportunity to remind them what's possible when they cross-pollinate their work is of great value. Wendy admits this gathering and the coordination of communication that Freshwater Partners and the Watershed Group served wasn't a silver bullet to provide all the resources that landowners needed. But she does think that it set the groundwork for future collaboration and resources that might come to landowners more efficiently if and when the next flood or emergency happens. As Wendy mentioned, the agencies also discussed alternative strategies to slow erosion and to improve future flood resiliency. These alternative strategies can include soft armoring of the riverbank, where willows, root balls, and other natural elements are utilized. Here, Druska mentions what this could look like for her property.
We know if you're going to do well on the land that you keep your riparian areas as healthy as you can, and we try. There are some places where we have to use things differently just because of circumstances, and we can't. The people that were down here were talking a lot about soft armoring. So that's using some of these root balls and big trees and big green slug things that appeared in the bank. And we're not opposed to doing anything like that, of course. But then given what the bank looks like, I don't know that armoring everything from here to where it used to be is the plan either. And you do have to keep in mind whatever you do on this side of the river will affect that side of the river.
Immediately following the 2022 flooding, the Watershed Group formed a subcommittee, the Upper Yellowstone River Assessment Committee, which consists of local landowners, agencies, and organizations. They coordinated and provided updates on recovery funding, technical support, and planning for future resiliency.
We didn't come back in and just rip-wrap it and lock it back into place and essentially create the issue we just saw.
The committee looked at a variety of elements, including where soft armoring made sense. One of the conclusions of the committee was understanding the importance of leaving the natural woody debris that was washed down from the floodwaters to create benefits such as erosion control, wildlife habitat, and elements that would slow down future floodwaters, helping to minimize impact on infrastructure and human communities. In the August after the floods, partner organizations including Montana Freshwater Partners, Park County Environmental Council, Trout Unlimited, and Yellow Dog Community and Conservation Foundation put on a Give Back to the Yellowstone River cleanup event, where members of the public volunteered their day on foot or boat to clean up not only trash, but mostly the unnatural debris that remained along the banks of the river in the months following the flood.
We saw an interest from folks wanting to do something tangible that they could see to help the river. I think having people come out and see firsthand some of the debris that they found along the river, which included kids' toys and parts of homes that went into the river, helps create an empathy and understanding that they were helping pick up parts of people's lives.
Wendy said over 60 people signed up to volunteer their day, and over 30 boats were on the river collecting trash and unnatural debris. At the end of the day, we were standing at the dumpsters where folks would come to unload their haul, and we saw folks unload everything from bed frames to washing machine parts to kids' tennis shoes, all that had been pulled from the river or the riverbank. There seemed to be an overall mood of folks recognizing the grave circumstance that created the loss of people's homes as they were recovering these items directly, combined with the uplifting, cohesive connection of doing physical work alongside fellow community members, giving back in a way that they were able. To thank folks for volunteering their day, the hosts of the river cleanup ended the day by providing food and live music at the local park, allowing folks to further connect. In the following clips, you'll hear from folks that we spoke with at that event, and you will hear the live music in the background, so bear with us on the audio distraction on those clips. Here, speaking about the notable community turnout, is Tom Coleman, longtime resident of Livingston and principal engineer at a local firm, Restoration Engineering, which specializes in river restoration.
Our Trout Unlimited chapter never used to do any summer events because nobody would show up. People are not going to show up in the summer during recreation season, and as you can see, pretty good turnout for the middle of summer. It's a big deal. It shows the commitment of the local people to this river.
And here is Connor Parrish, resident of Livingston and program manager for Trout Unlimited.
There's so many people that come from all over the world, really, to recreate and spend time on the Yellowstone River, and understanding that this incredible stream that's flowing down there and comes through Livingston and out of Yellowstone National Park, we have to take care of it. And so trying to tie people to that in a way that they care about it and they want to give back. And that's, kind of what today is about.
Here is Ashton Bunce, resident of Livingston and biologist and program manager for Montana Freshwater Partners. She works with Wendy and not only saw the damage along the shores from the day's cleanup, but for her job, she has been out on the ground meeting with landowners and seeing the impact firsthand.
There's a lot of stuff really high up on people's property. It's really mixed in with woody debris, and people are generally feeling really overwhelmed by their properties, the state of it, and not sure how to start rummaging through everything, sorting everything. It's going to take a village, and it's going to take some time for sure to sort through it all.
Now we go back to our chat with Wendy Weaver as she recollects the whirlwind of emotions that she experienced the day of the peak flooding. As a professional focused on river health, she saw it both from a human impact perspective and an ecological perspective.
It was a very emotional day. It was really hard to see houses going into the river. Friends that were having to get swiftwater rescued out of their places because it came up so fast. So seeing that happen was really hard and emotional. It was hard to see that and then also see just what in my mind was a beautiful event for the river, and just seeing that power and that force come down. I know it's important for river health, and so it was just a day of mixed emotions.
I asked Wendy to elaborate on these benefits to river health that periodic flooding can create.
When rivers flood, it's a very important function for river health. It moves sediment that may have been there for long periods of time. It creates new channels. The deposition on sandbars help recruit new cottonwood forests, seedlings, and other plant species that are important for river health. So it essentially creates new life.
Here again is Scott Frazier, Traditional Ecological Knowledge educator, as he continues on that topic.
To see some of those logs come down the river, some of those big old trees, the power of that river grabbing that log and relocating it, it's amazing to think about it. And that's what people need to start to try to do, is think about the river, think about that log, think about how many rocks did it bump into. It's, you're just watching a most wonderful purging and recycling of life. And if you're just looking at the log, you're kind of missing some of it. You're missing what's in the water. I think when the river really shows its power, we're in awe. And it's a wonderful thing because it really stands up above us and we are afraid, which we should be. It amazed me that people are still getting permits to buy and put houses there, which is telling me that people are not connected to the environment. And that flood opened their eyes that these sort of things we have no control of, and that's a good thing.
As Scott mentions, this disconnect that the general public can have from its own environment includes underestimating the environment's power and its ability to be controlled. I ask him his opinion on what elements that he thinks have fed our general disconnect.
We lost connection when the system said, that's the environment and we're the people and we're different. That's when it all changed. When we stepped out of the environment and the environment's outside the window, that's when we changed as a society. And we have been designed now to collect data without realizing that there's traditional data to be collected.
Scott shares a story from his work to show a definable moment of disconnect.
Now, I did a project up on the Missouri River, It was with the 28 tribes of the Missouri. And people went in and interviewed elders of the Missouri. One of the things, when I reviewed the tapes of these interviews, one of the things that I found interesting was that a lot of the women that went to get water with their grandma when they were little girls, they missed that. And when water was put into the homes, they no longer were given education from their grandmas or their aunties. All of a sudden now water is available. There was no work involved. And those elders that were interviewed, they missed that connection.
I find this interesting how this example shows that a disconnect from our environment also equated to a social and cultural disconnection, which maybe there are parallels to this in our modern world, as certain services that may create more efficiency or ease for us may also result in a disconnect between ourselves and the people and place around us. Scott elaborates on this disconnect of our general society from our environments.
You can talk water and you can talk environment. Doesn't mean you're connected. It just means you're talking. We need to teach young people a different approach to science than just collecting data on a piece of paper. We actually need them to go and stand by the river and listen to it. When you start seeing the river in your heart rather than your head and your brain, you'll start to actually understand how this works and how we work. That river's been there for quite a few years. It knows how to do what it does, and when it wants to change, it will change. Now, what other animal does that? And that's the human being. You know, the river is probably how we chose to live in a lot of ways. It gave us design. Don't look at the Yellowstone River as it's designed after a human being. Look at the human being designed after the river.
One could argue that an element of disconnect is the approach to control our own environments. The Yellowstone River is not unlike other rivers of the world, where the past century has seen attempts to control their path and flow to protect our built infrastructure, which is often built along or intersecting with rivers, including railroads, highways, towns, and homes. This controlling can include straightening the river into a channel, called channelization, also adding large rock or riprap, or hardening the riverbanks in other ways. Of course, our infrastructure has been essential to our modern ways of life, and soft armoring does not work in every scenario. It's more just stating the things to keep in mind as we go forward, as we now collectively know more about the impacts of these modifications. Wendy elaborates on this, as that's one of the things that the work of Montana Freshwater Partners entails, is restoring rivers' natural floodplains where it makes sense, in areas where they've been modified.
Some other alterations include blocking side channels. So these side channels in floodplains are necessary during times of flooding to absorb the water, slow it down. And when we block those side channels off, it shoots that intensity and that power in the main channel, and that's where we see even worse erosion and flooding impacts. That is what creates resiliency in a river, is maintaining a healthy floodplain. And I'm not sure we understand that connection in such a way. And we know that it's a balance between these economies. We're not going to remove an entire interstate system adjacent to a river. We know that. So we try to balance that, because the more we control it, the more it's going to release its energy in ways that causes damage in places we don't want it to happen.
Wendy elaborates on some of the ecological impacts of modifying or controlling rivers with built infrastructure.
We know that when rivers are hardened and controlled, if they're dammed, it essentially strips them of that natural function. And that's when you see fisheries collapse, you see bug communities, wildlife collapse, and you see issues of temperature, you see issues of water quality really start to impact it when that natural function is removed. In many ways, this river is coming out and it's kind of regaining, and re-owning the area that it knows it needs to move across to be healthy.
Wendy mentions how 100 years ago, when much of our current built infrastructure in towns began being built, from railroad lines to homestead sites to entire towns, those doing the building didn't fully understand the impact of restricting a river's floodplain. Not to mention the financial impact when that infrastructure is destroyed due to things like flooding. But it does make one wonder why still today we see new construction, from residential to larger infrastructure, being built on the bank of the river or in the proximity of the floodplain, at least for instances where it's non-essential. Dale Sexton speaks here to other impacts of this, beyond just the restricting of a river's floodplain and the potential financial impact if a large-scale flood occurs.
Land development up to the banks of the river is a problem. When somebody elects to build a home within the riparian area or within a very close distance to that, it affects the ecology. It's like the death of 1,000 cuts. And all of these homes are on septic systems, and one or two is one thing, but several thousand, and then all of a sudden you have measurable impacts. And not to mention, the river bottoms are migration corridors. It's where wildlife goes to seek sanctuary. Where all of a sudden you've got development within that corridor, it affects that calming area that is so critical for wildlife.
As Montana's population is currently experiencing a growth spurt, which includes growing pains, it creates an increase in development. Not only residential, but also infrastructure to serve our growing township needs. It's an important component to keep in mind, whether you're a developer, a policymaker, or a resident who has the power to speak up about it, since we can now say that we know better. Here is Wendy.
That is actually one of the reasons that I left the engineering world. I had this realization that we were trying to engineer our way out of challenges that we were creating from growing as communities and the way in which we were doing that. And I pivoted and went into the conservation world. And I think that's kind of it's the compass that we use to guide our work. And nature knows what it needs, and nature will rebalance. And the more that we can allow nature to do her thing, the more resilient and healthy our systems will be.
And as an example of taking local action and engaging with local government, Montana Freshwater Partners began working with both city and county government to ensure decision makers have up-to-date planning tools, such as floodplain mapping, to better inform plans and policies that not only benefit river health, but that are fiscally responsible for taxpayers and prioritize public safety. Here is Scott Fraser.
What we need to do is start thinking about how to actually get involved with the pulse of the river. How do we teach the kids to understand not to build a house down in a floodplain? We don't take away riparian areas. We don't take away places that absorb the shock of a flood. How does the river teach us?
Here is Wendy, showing the interconnection of all elements within a watershed.
When we're looking at the health of a river system, that begins way beyond the banks of the river. It really starts up in the mountains because that is where the snowpack comes from that feeds our rivers. The path in which that snowpack melts off and enters into the river systems is also a part of what makes a healthy system. We have to look at the soils, we have to look at the tributaries and degradation if that's happened in those tributaries as well, because that impacts ultimately overall river health.
In any watershed, flooding impacts can also be decreased by elements that improve the ground's ability to absorb moisture and snowmelt that runs off the mountains. Having healthy forests and grasslands, biodiverse soils, and having unpaved ground surfaces upland from a river all improve the ground's ability to absorb moisture, preventing unnatural amounts of runoff, and therefore decreasing the risk of flood. Also, unchanneled waterways, which are able to naturally meander, allow water to slow down and seep deeper into the soils to replenish the underground aquifers. So, as you can imagine, these elements not only decrease impacts from flood, but they improve water retention during drought. Here's Wendy speaking about the work of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group.
The work that we were doing prior to this historic flood was around drought. These are not only strategies for drought resiliency, they're strategies for flood resiliency. They're one and the same thing.
The Watershed Group has indeed been undergoing an extensive drought management plan that's informed and guided by folks on the ground, experiencing the impacts firsthand. And as much of the western U.S. and many places around the world have been experiencing, large parts of Montana have also been experiencing severe drought. Climate studies of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, released in 2021, showed evidence that this pattern of long periods of drought, peppered with factors that lead to flash flood events, would become more prevalent going forward. Here is Dale Sexton.
The biggest elephant in the room is climate change. We really need to understand its effect and how this flood, while the Yellowstone floods every spring, this was not a normal event. And so many of these catastrophic events are becoming normalized in our society, I feel like.
Dale recounts the roller coaster of 2022's weather patterns.
For us in March to be sitting here like, wow, this could be the driest summer on record, to 2 months later, like, woohoo, we've gotten all this moisture, this is terrific. But then, one of the most extreme nature events that we've ever experienced, and then now all of a sudden, the last 6 weeks have been some of our hottest and driest on record. It's not normal. We need to come to terms with that. We need to come to terms with keeping the flow into the heart, making sure that flow is clean and clear, the heart being the Yellowstone. And I get emotional about some things. And it's hard to talk about it.
I'm going to pull away here briefly and catch some words on this topic from Scott Fraser.
We need to understand that we all have a part to play in this. What we're doing is turning a blind eye. We're patching up where we've had a disaster, a hurricane, or we've had floods like we had in Gardner. The earth is telling us something, and we're not designed to listen to it anymore. So we need to rethink that, and we need to start with the young people because they see the problem.
And now back to Dale Sexton for a closing thought.
I think it's really important that all the various entities understand how important the Yellowstone River is, and that we do everything within our means to make sure that it's here for future generations.
Thank you so much to everyone who spoke with us for these interviews. Wendy Weaver, Jessica Kinke, Scott Fraser, Dale Sexton, Connor Parrish, Ashton Bunce, and Tom Coleman. You can find links to all of the things mentioned here today in this episode's show notes, including the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group, who you can also follow on Facebook. You'll also find links to other collaborative efforts connected to the region that maybe we didn't mention in this episode. And you'll find a link to the Give Back to the Yellowstone campaign if you'd like to support this community-guided work that's benefiting the Yellowstone River and the people connected to it. Be sure to keep an eye out for our next episode, which is part 2 of the Upper Yellowstone River story. Topics in our next episode will include the impacts of increased river recreation numbers, a proactive community-guided response to this, as well as topics of community disconnects, increased wealth disparities, and how this connects to the health of the landscape. And also digging further into the challenging but rewarding human dynamics of collaborative efforts, such as the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. You can find all of the films and podcasts that are part of the Life in the Land project at lifeintheland.org. Reach out if you would like to incorporate a film episode into an upcoming meeting, a gathering, or in the classroom, all for free. And if you would like support in facilitating a discussion after the film. This second season of the Life in the Land project is generously supported by the Greater Montana Foundation, which benefits the people of Montana by encouraging communication with an emphasis on electronic media on issues, trends, and values of importance to present and future generations of Montana. This season is also supported by the Crocus Foundation, Bioregions International, the Nature Conservancy, Montana Watershed Coordination Council, Montana Forest Collaboration Network, Foundation for Community Vitality, Courtney Scott, and Kestrel Ariel. With additional support from Blackfoot Communications, Heart of the Rockies Initiative, Northern Great Plains Joint Venture, Sarah Rubik, Rodney Fry, Beth Madden, Gary Whitted, Fernanda Robert, and Bill Long and Billy Miller. Thank you all so much for listening. We appreciate it if you're able to share this episode with others and subscribe to the Stories for Action podcast. Find out more about all of our work, including films and storytelling workshops, at storiesforaction.org. And check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Stories for Action. Thank you so much for being a part of our community, where our mission is to spark positive change for people and place through the power of storytelling.